We're going to examine the later part of the Cold War and the difficulties that the United States and the Soviet Union have as the two superpowers that emerge after World War II. This is a picture of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon became president in the midst of the Vietnam War. And one of the things that he does is he promises that the United States will have an honorable end to the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was very controversial in the United States, and it led to a lot of division of people on their views. He promises this end. I think he strives to try to get it. However, in the end, the United States does make a peace treaty with, negotiates a peace treaty between North and South Vietnam, and they were supposed to then, we pulled out our troops, then they were to negotiate how to create a unified government. But in April of 1975, we see that Vietnam, South Vietnam, is under heavy attack and surrenders. Another thing Nixon is noted for is his diplomacy with China. And, you know, Nixon's time in office is, of course, marked by the Watergate problems that he has. And, of course, domestically, he has a lot of problems there and eventually resigns from office and leaves rather than be forced out. But one of the things he does do in foreign policy is works with China. He visits China in 1972 and tries to, and actually does make an agreement with China. Nixon had been a strong critic of communism, and so it has been said, for example, only Nixon could go to China. In other words, if a leader who had not been, a president who had not been so strongly against communism had gone to China, it would not have had the same impact. But he visits China in 1972. Many people thought that he would never return. He thought they might be killed there or kidnapped or something like that. But his visit goes well and sets up a trade agreement with China, which basically puts a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. Now, North Vietnam does agree to a treaty at the Paris Peace Conference in 1973, and part of Nixon's visiting China is also to bring about a resolution in Vietnam, because China had been backing North Vietnam for many years, sending it weapons, equipment, training soldiers, etc. So North Vietnam agrees to a treaty at the Paris Peace Conference of 1973. The U.S., according to this treaty, would remove all of its troops, and North Vietnam then agreed to a political settlement with South Vietnam. So here you see a very common image of the Vietnam War, where U.S. troops heavily relied upon helicopters to move them in and out of hot zones, and the foot soldier that you see here would have to march through tall grasses, jungle, swampy areas, and often had to deal with traps and explosive devices and so forth. Well, after the U.S. pulls out, and these negotiations are supposed to take place between North and South Vietnam, as might be predicted, the talks began to break down, and the fighting resumed in 1975. But this time without the United States troops being there. And in short order then, by 1976, the communist North Vietnam came to rule over the entire country. And in fact, even changed the name of Saigon, it was the capital of South Vietnam, to Ho Chi Minh City. Of course, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the communists in Vietnam. Now, other changes were taking place. Some of them, of course, with China now, say after 72, things are improving with the U.S. One thing that the U.S. had to give up to get this to happen was to stop their defense treaty with Taiwan, the Republic of China. You might remember that there had been a civil war in China against communist forces led by Mao, who was backed by the Soviet Union. And Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Republic or Republican forces in China, backed by the United States. The United States didn't give as much aid, many people think or thought that they could have, in part because after developing the nuclear weapon or weapons that we could use to defeat Japan, China was not as strategic to us militarily to end World War II. And so we sort of backed away from getting more involved there. Eventually, as you might remember, the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek are pushed southward by the Korean forces in the north, and eventually will retreat to the island of Taiwan. Here they set up their government. They claim they are the legitimate government of China. And of course, Mao takes over the mainland and sets up his government. So this had been a point where the United States had a defense treaty with Taiwan. They would send military forces there, they'd do military exercises there and so forth. Of course, the communist Chinese didn't like this idea. And we'll see then that we had to lessen our support for Taiwan to get Chinese support. Chinese officials then, communist Chinese officials, pledged to attempt a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. That is, that they wouldn't just go in and invade and take it over. Taiwan is still free today, although its freedom is somewhat limited today, overwhelmed by the wealth and the power of communist China. Now, Khrushchev, who we'll talk about in a later talk here in more detail, he calls for the U.S. To have peace in Vietnam as well. A very controversial leader. Khrushchev comes to power after Stalin in the Soviet Union. Other changes that then come once Khrushchev is ousted in 1964, Leonid Brezhnev comes to power in the Soviet Union. He's willing to appease China and support North Vietnam, and so we see things beginning to intensify there. But he's also willing to negotiate with the United States, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. What had happened, of course, is towards the end of World War II, the United States had been working on a nuclear weapon throughout World War II. They finally were able to produce a couple of them and drop them, of course, on Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. This finally forced the Japanese to surrender, and then made sure that the U.S. did not have to make an amphibious assault on all of the different Japanese islands. Well, the United States was the only power to have nuclear weapons at that point. In fact, some scientists within the United States leaked out the information about nuclear weapons to the Soviets. I guess they thought the U.S. shouldn't have that power alone, and the Soviets were able to catch up in that area. And within a short amount of time, they also had nuclear weapons. So what we had was a kind of standoff, or the two superpowers, both had nuclear weapons. They were both producing them at a high rate. They were both militarily poised to use them. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or AMT, also called Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT. These treaties then, in 1972, will begin to limit the number of nuclear weapons that the two countries have, but they still had much more weapons than they needed to totally wipe out each other, and probably about everywhere else too. So there was some negotiations. There was much fear during this time of a nuclear attack that the Soviets might launch in the Soviet Union. They were concerned we might launch an attack on them. And so we see that there is some limitations here in the early 1970s, but there was just a proliferation of nuclear weapons from the U.S. and USSR since World War II, certainly in the 1960s. And also the technology of this had been increasing as, of course, the United States went to the moon and developed space travel and computers and many of the things that came out of that. By 1970, the United States had developed what were called intercontinental ballistic missiles. Up to this point, in the 1960s, you would have to launch a nuclear weapon from much closer range. This is why the U.S. had its agreements, as part of its agreements with NATO, had missiles that could be launched from Europe that could hit the Soviet Union, and in fact even had mobile missile launchers that could do that. But by 1970, the technology was there where basically you would have a missile, like what you see here pictured, that could be launched from the United States, and it would hit any target, but especially it was aimed at the Soviet Union. These missile silos were out in the center of the United States, in places like Nebraska, Kansas, and so forth. They were underground, so you couldn't really see them. There'd be cornfields around, and what would happen if these needed to be launched is that the doors would open and the missile would come firing up out of the ground and would go into the edges of space, and then it would descend down on the target, say in the Soviet Union. And also what had developed, instead of just having one missile per, or one bomb per rocket, there were multiple warheads that could be placed in one, on top of one rocket. So in other words, you can launch this one rocket here, and in it, in the head of it, it would open up when it was, once it got out of the atmosphere, it would open up, and then there would be multiple warheads inside. Each of these warheads was independently targeted for re-entry, it was called. You know, the military likes their abbreviations, their acrostics. So ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And then MIRVs, M-I-R-V, multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs. So this basically means you could launch one missile, or let's say you launch 10, you might be hitting 50 targets or more with just those 10. So this really, really had advanced from, let's say, the 20 years, 25 years since the first one was used, to having now weapons that could be launched from the United States and would have little warning. It would give little warning to the Soviets. Now, of course, the Soviets are developing that as well, for aimed at us. By 1972, the Soviets had this technology. What this led to then was what some have called MAD, or MAD, mutually assured destruction. The U.S. and the USSR had anti-ballistic missiles that they would aim and try to hit and destroy missiles before they were armed. These were not perfected, but they did offer some defense, but really not enough. The U.S. wanted to assure equivalence. The idea with MAD, or mutually assured destruction, the idea went like this: if the Soviets know that when they launch, that we will launch an attack, say 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, that they won't see any advantage to launching their missiles, because while they will wipe us out, we will also wipe them out about a half an hour later. So for both of us, this was mutually assured destruction if you use these multiple weapons. So that's what the acrostic MAD stands for: mutually assured destruction. Well, after Nixon is forced to resign, Gerald R. Ford, his vice president, takes over as president. And this will lead to another agreement. This is the SALT Treaty with Brezhnev. Here you see a picture of Ford and Brezhnev signing the agreement. This is called SALT I, or Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 1. Of course, that means there's going to be another one. The Helsinki Agreement of 1975 had said that the borders of World War II should be recognized, and this was signed by everybody, because that had never been done. You waited 30 years to actually agree that what the borders were and what the countries were. And we will see the beginnings of the softening of relations, a détente as it's called, and improvement somewhat of relations with the Soviet Union with the signing of these agreements. And so, as you probably have read or know, Nixon resigns in 1974 due to the Watergate scandal, which was basically people working for the Nixon campaign to be reelected broke into the Democratic headquarters looking for information, I guess you might call it dirt, that they can use against the Democrats. In the process, they are caught. They begin to talk about it. The president and the people who work for him begin to distance themselves from that, cover it up. And eventually, when all this begins coming out, Nixon decides to resign. His vice president had already resigned before that, Spiro Agnew, and so Gerald R. Ford, the guy pictured here, was placed in to be vice president by Nixon. And then when Nixon resigns, Gerald R. Ford finds himself in to be the only president who was ever president of the United States who was not elected to be either vice president or president. He was never elected to either office. When he ran for election, he ended up losing to Jimmy Carter. So he had just a partial term. He didn't even have a full term as president. Jimmy Carter becomes president then in 1977. By this point, Vietnam is over. The United States was out of that, and in fact, Vietnam had been captured by the communists. Relations were improving somewhat with China, but of course, not very good with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been promoting communism in the third world, especially Africa, trying to set up communist dictators and strongmen around the world. Places like Somalia, South Yemen, Ethiopia. And in fact, the Soviets were working with Cuban operatives. The Cubans would go and train in guerrilla warfare many of these people in, say, Africa and other parts of the world. So there was an effort, a sort of concerted effort of the Soviets, the Cubans, and others to promote communism in other parts of the world. Angola, of course, definitely Cuban troops were sent there to help the communist rebels even take over the country. So Jimmy Carter will end up being a one-term president. He has a lot of troubles with the Soviet Union. He's going to have increasing troubles in the Middle East. But the Soviets have their own problems in other parts of the world, especially in Afghanistan. In their efforts to support Marxist governments in 1979, the Soviet Union supported rebels in Afghanistan who were Marxist and who were attempting to take over the government and to abolish Muslim customs. And of course, this was quite difficult because, as you know, communism is an atheistic philosophy, a political philosophy. It does not believe in God. And of course, the Muslim culture is very strongly believing in God. So this was a heated fight. And there was fear the Soviets might win. And if they won, they might move into Iran, because it was also an upheaval, and that the Soviets would gain control of Afghanistan and Iran and the oil sources that are there and be poised to get more control in the Middle East. The Shah of Iran had been overthrown by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who ruled the land in a very hardline Islamic state. The Shah, of course, had been corrupt, but had been very much a friend of the West, especially the United States and England and so forth. And since Iran had a lot of oil, this was a nice agreement for the West. But when the Ayatollah comes and takes over, this threatens that. Now, Jimmy Carter set forth a doctrine, an idea that the United States would use force, military force, if necessary, to guard Middle East oil supplies. This comes to be known as the Carter Doctrine. So the idea here is that we would defend access to oil, defend governments that were pumping oil, because it was in our best interest as well, defensively and so forth. Now, the Soviets then were attempting to control Islamic fundamentalist thinking in Afghanistan, because they were fearful that if this Islamic fundamentalism, which you were seeing rising in Iran and was growing in Afghanistan, would spread to the Soviet-controlled territories just to the north, which are also Islamic, places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and so forth. And so they wanted to try to curtail that as much as they could. Now, of course, the United States was not really anxious to get involved directly in fighting in Afghanistan. After our experience in Vietnam, many people were fearful of doing that, and some people called this the Vietnam syndrome, that the U.S. was fearful in getting involved with what some people would call another Vietnam, a conflict that would drag on, for which there would be It was often called no exit strategy. How are we ever going to stop this war? How are we ever going to, when would we have won? What are the conditions in which we would leave? And so what the United States will end up doing is backing rebels within Afghanistan that were fighting the Soviet Union. We'd give them training. We'd give them weapons. A lot of this took place in Pakistan, right across the border. We would get them heat-seeking missiles, shoulder-launched heat-seeking missiles, which could bring down Soviet helicopters, and give them training and other weapons. By the way, many of those people that the United States trained in the late 70s and early 80s will later be the same people, people who will later cause terrorism and give us trouble. And so, a lot of people are very surprised by that, but this is sort of illustrates the historic principle that's often there, which I've mentioned in class before, and that is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So it doesn't mean I'm friends with the person. I'm friends with them because they're enemy of my enemy. And so I help them for now, and then, of course, in the future. Like we helped Saddam Hussein. We helped here in Afghanistan Osama bin Laden. Wasn't that we were good supporters of them and what all they were doing, but at the time they were doing something that would help us in fighting against our enemies. Now, Jimmy Carter ran into a lot of problems because of the hostage crisis. The hostage crisis takes place in Iran, where this new radical government in Iran takes over the U.S. embassy and holds many of the people in the embassy hostage. And this happens in, well, just before the election, actually months before the election, and it goes on for months, actually. Went on over a year they were held hostage. And Jimmy Carter attempted to launch a strike force that would go in and liberate them. That did not work. The helicopters crashed in the desert. They said probably because it picked up dust by flying low over the desert. At any rate, it made Jimmy Carter look quite inept, and the crisis went on. And as the election was taking place, the candidate who emerges against Jimmy Carter is Ronald Reagan, and he makes it a campaign issue and said that he would get the hostages out. He would use military force and just go in and take them. Well, at any rate, when Ronald Reagan is sworn in as president, the same day the hostages are released. So some people interpret it in different ways, but I suppose they decided they didn't really want to keep the hostages that bad. So the hostages were released. And Ronald Reagan would take a much harder line against the Soviet Union as well. He ends up calling them the evil empire. And he begins to push against them and the training they were doing in the third world countries and so forth. He develops new weaponry, pushes for that, supports the military. During this time, the cruise missile is developed. And in fact, the cruise missile could be armed with nuclear weapons. This becomes then a very difficult thing because for the Soviets, because the cruise missile could be launched from a submarine. It could be launched from a mobile area. It could be launched long ways away. And it flies very low to the ground using cameras and so forth. They had it all plotted in, the routes that it would take. So it could not be detected. Couldn't be detected on radar and other detecting devices until it was too late. And these things could be perfectly targeted to hit a building in a city, hit a car, rolling down the road and so forth. And so it was kind of a game changer. It upped the ante that the Soviets were going to have to try to counter that. And of course their economy was failing, so they couldn't. He also introduced the idea for what was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. The media labeled it Star Wars. Basically what this was a plan to put into place, actually orbiting in space, would be a series of lasers and mirrors, things that could target any Soviet missiles that might launch, and to neutralize them before they could be activated and descend. It was never fully perfected, and but following his time as president, the funding also declined, although it did lead to more defensive missile targeting, which is still used today, called the Patriot missile. And the Israelis use their Iron Shield, it's called, which is basically U.S. anti-missile defense that they have on their Iron Dome, their iron, which basically then if somebody launches something, they launch a counter missile and basically hit it in the air and blow it up before it gets armed. So for these reasons then, we see developing what's going on in the Cold War, let's say from the 1950s, 60s up till the 1980s. So we'll leave it there for right now.